So in this video, I'm going to show you how to apply strain gauges to steel rebar. So first, you're obviously going to need your steel rebar to mount the strain gauge to. And then you're also going to need some basic equipment. Starting with isopropyl alcohol or alcohol wipes to disinfect the surface prior to application of the strain gauge. It just cleans it, makes sure it doesn't short circuit. You're going to need electrical tape as well. Fabric tape. You could also use electrical tape in place of this, however I like fabric tape a little bit better. Okay. You're also going to need an X-Acto knife as shown here, wire cutters, just like that, quick dry epoxy, and then as well as super glue, a multimeter to measure the resistance and make sure that the strain gauge is working properly, your wire to connect the strain gauge to the digital acquisition unit. And then lastly, you're only going to need the soldering items that you typically require. So typical soldering wire, flux, and off-screen the soldering kit as well. Now prior to the application of the strain gauges, you're going to want to grind the surface smooth. So normally you would start with wrought iron just like that, where it's ribbed. However, you want to grind it nice and smooth until it kind of looks like this, where there's not really any grooves or any changes within the surface. Right, so to do that, you can use a typical sander or grinder as in the lab. After grinding down the surface, you're going to want to clean this with your isopropyl alcohol, so let's do that right now. And you're only going to want to go in one direction to avoid spreading it over again. And this is going to remove any metal filaments or anything that could potentially short circuit the strain gauge. Now that I've disinfected the surface and removed all the metal filaments, the next step is to apply a layer of electrical tape around each of the bars. Now this is going to protect the strain gauge from coming in contact with the steel, so the nodes of the strain gauge are not going to touch. That way it doesn't short circuit. So I'm going to cut a little piece and wrap it all around the bar. And that's what the X-Acto knife is for, just to speed things up a bit. In the next step, you're going to take out the strain gauge from the package, right, and it should look like this inside the plastic. Yeah, you can see the nodes, and then as well it also has a lead side, so a part with two metal pieces attached to the strain gauge, and then a flat side on the back. So you're going to want to find the side with the leads on it, and that's going to be facing upwards. You're going to take the nodes carefully out of the package and just slide them to the very end. Okay. Just like that, now that the nodes are sticking out, and you're going to bend them upwards because that's going to help with the installation. Bend them outwards and then spread them apart from each other so that way they don't come in contact. Right, as shown right here. Right. Additionally, in each of the strain gauge kits, this should also come with a series of metal or a series of plastic sheets, very thin sheets like this. This is going to prevent any super glue from sticking to yourself, so that way you can easily apply the strain gauge to the bar. Right, so that sheet's going to go right on top of the strain gauge. Right. Now we're going to apply crazy glue or super glue to the surface of the steel, right where we want to apply our strain gauge. So I want to apply it right here. Okay, just like that. And I'm going to tilt it a little bit upwards so that way it doesn't drip. Right, now the leads of the strain gauge are going to rest over top the electrical tape, while the red portion of the strain gauge touches the actual metal. Okay, carefully apply it. Okay, and once it's applied, you're going to want to hold down and put pressure on it and make sure there's no air bubbles within this strain gauge or underneath it, because that will affect the readings that you get. So you're going to hold this down for approximately 1 minute. After holding it down for about 1 minute, you're going to remove the plastic sheet very carefully, pulling it slowly off the strain gauge. Right? And then we're just going to place it to the side. Now this can potentially be reused for other strain gauges. That way you can save some of the plastic sheets that you have. Okay. Now that the strain gauge is mounted, we're going to wrap it in our fabric tape. So there's tape right here, just to ensure that it doesn't fall off or that it's mounted properly. Okay, so let me just take off a piece. Now you want to be very careful when you do this, just because the strain gauge may not be seated entirely proper too. Right? So you're going to want to be very delicate when you do this part. I'm going to cut off a piece and wrap it all the way around. Okay. And at the end, you should have something that looks like this, where the leads are shown here and there, and the strain gauge is underneath this white fabric. Now, prior to moving forward, we're going to check the resistance of the strain gauge to make sure that it's working properly and that it hasn't short-circuited or there's any other problems that foresee. So to do this, I'm going to use a multimeter and I'm going to check the resistance. Right? Now, the reading should get 120, so that's what we're going to check. And there we are, 120 ohms. Right? So now that we have 120 ohms, we know it's working properly. The next step is we're going to bend these wires slightly, right, into these little hooks like this. Right? This is going to make sure there's no tension on the gauge, so that way when we mount it, it stays proper. The next step is we're going to have to solder some of our electrical cables onto the strain gauge itself. Now, prior to applying the wire to my strain gauge, as shown here, right, I have a wire that looks like this. Right, it's a bulk end and it has different wires inside, and I'm going to have to cut it to expose them. So to do that, I'm going to grab my X-Acto knife. Okay. I'm going to just lightly cut the plastic cover, twist, right, exposing everything inside. I'm going to separate the various contents. Okay. So you should have a little protective little wire like this, a metal protective insulation, a grounding wire shown here, metal wire, and then 4 different color wires, a green, white, black, and red. Okay. Now I only need the white, black, and red wire. So the rest of the wires I'm going to crinkle together, and using my wire cutters, I'm just going to cut them off because I don't need them. And I'm going to throw them down. Now for these wires, I have to expose the wire first, and then I'm going to connect the red and black wires together, and the white one's going to be separate. So first, let me just strip them. Okay. And the red one last. Alright, now that they're all exposed, I'm going to twist the black and red wires together. Right, and then I'll just twist the white one just so it's straight. Alright, and at the end, this is how it should look like, the black and red together and the white separately. And I'm also going to do that to the other side of the yellow wire as well. Now that the wires are all ready to be soldered, the next step I'm going to do is I'm going to get my flux, okay, as shown here, and I'm just going to poke the wires into it lightly just to get a little bit of flux. Right, so something that looks like that should be more than enough. Do a little bit more. Okay. The next step is I'm going to get my solder and my soldering iron, and I'm going to melt some of the solder and then apply my wires onto it. It doesn't really matter which way you apply, left side or right side, the black or red wire, it should be okay. So let me just melt some solder really quickly. Then I'm going to mount my wires. And let me do the same with the white wire. Okay, the white wire is now connected as well. Okay. And then you should get something that looks like this. Now prior to proceeding, it's always good to check the resistance. So I'm going to grab the free end of the yellow wire, and now I'm going to check the resistance. Okay. Alright, 120. So I know that the strain gauge is working properly and there's no problems with the solder. The next step is to protect this little area right here using some electrical tape. Right. Now I need to make sure when I do this that the two wires don't come in contact with each other. So the red and the white, or the red and black and the white don't touch. Additionally, I need to make sure they also don't touch the steel so that way they don't short circuit. So I'm going to get a little bit more electrical tape. Alright, and I will just mount it like that. And now these wires are going to sit right here on top. Next, I'm just going to start wrapping. Okay, so I'm going to start with the red wire first. Okay. I'm going to bend them a little bit so they don't touch. And then I will just wrap around, covering the white wire as well. Okay, and additionally I also have some of this, the leads exposed, so I will wrap those as well. It's always better to use a little bit more tape than a little bit less, just because you don't want any problems when you cast your concrete or do any further experimental testing. Okay. Now these wires are also exposed, so I could cover them as well. So let's do that. And at each step, when you do something, you always want to check the resistance, making sure it's still okay. So let's do that right now. At this point, the strain gauge is mounted and it's fine. The next step is to protect it using some epoxy. So I have this quick dry epoxy right here. It's a Gorilla Glue, or Gorilla brand, sorry. Right, and it's two parts. So let's apply. Right, so now that I got my epoxy, I've already poured it and I've mixed it for 20 seconds. Next, I'm going to apply onto the strain gauge. So the white part is where the strain gauge is, and the black part is where the wire is. So I'm going to apply throughout. Right? You can also do multiple layers once it hardens, so that's also an option as well. And there you have it. Right, so I'm going to let that sit. It's supposed to dry in approximately 5 minutes or so. And after that, the strain gauge is ready to be used within concrete. Okay, so that's the end of the tutorial. I hope you enjoyed and you learned.